When my son told me I was too old to keep up, I smiled. If only he knew whose name was actually on the papers he signed. We were standing in the glass office I'd built from scratch 23 years ago, the same space where his small hands once clung to my arm, asking how machines worked. Back then, I dreamed of building something for him. Now, that same boy, my own flesh and blood, stood across from me in a $1,000 suit, looking at me like I was an outdated piece of equipment. "Dad," he said, his voice low but sharp, "you've done enough. It's time to let the younger team handle things." Younger team. He meant himself. The office smelled of expensive coffee and polished marble. I remembered when it used to smell like motor oil and sweat. When we used to work side by side in that old repair shop, fixing engines, chasing contracts, dreaming big. He'd called me his hero then. Said he'd never forget what I'd taught him. But money changes people faster than time does. I tried to keep my tone steady. "I started this company with my own two hands, son. You were in college when we signed our first big deal." He sighed, looking out at the skyline. All those high-rise towers glittering with the pride of people who'd stepped on someone to get there. "Exactly. And look where we are now. Don't you think it's time for me to take it from here?" It wasn't a question. It was an announcement. He'd already decided. That's when the HR director walked in, a woman half my age, holding an envelope like it was a verdict. My son didn't even look at me as she placed it on the desk. "This is just formality, Mr. Warren," she said softly. "Your termination package has been processed." Termination package. For the man who built the company's first table out of plywood and nails. For the man who worked through pneumonia to deliver the first prototype on time. I looked at my son. "You really think I'll sign this?" He finally turned to face me. Cold, composed, confident. "Dad, this isn't personal. It's business. You'll still get your pension. Just enjoy your retirement." I wanted to shout, to tell him how blind he'd become. But instead, I just nodded. Because sometimes silence cuts deeper than anger. He thought I was finished, that the ink on that paper was the end of my story. But he didn't know what I'd done years ago, quietly, carefully, when the company was just starting to bloom. I'd made sure that our intellectual property, our designs, our foundation, all of it, couldn't be transferred without my signature. Not a single investor or lawyer had noticed. And so, as he sat there thinking he'd won, I picked up that envelope, smiled faintly, and said, "You're right, son. You've done well. I'm proud of you." His shoulders relaxed, his arrogance glowing like a crown. He thought I'd surrendered. But deep inside, something old and steady woke up in me. The part of me that had built everything from dust. The part of me that remembered promises made in grease-stained hands and broken nights. He'd fired his father. But he had no idea. He'd just fired the one man holding the keys to his empire. As I left the building, the evening air felt colder than usual. The lights of the company logo glowed behind me, reflecting in the windows like a ghost of what I'd created. I whispered to myself, "All right, son, you want to play business? Let's see how far you get without the man who built your world." And for the first time in years, I felt something dangerous stir inside me. Not rage, but purpose. A quiet storm. For the first few days after he fired me, I didn't leave the house. The silence was heavy, like a weight pressing against my chest. My hands, once steady and sure, didn't know what to do anymore. I kept staring at the walls of my old workshop, the one I'd refused to sell even after the company grew. Dust had settled on the shelves, tools were still hanging in perfect rows, and the faint smell of metal and wood reminded me who I really was. Not a CEO, not a number on a spreadsheet, just a man who knew how to build things that lasted. People called, of course, old employees, clients, even a few friends from the early days. But I didn't answer. They all thought I'd been forced into retirement, that I was done. I let them believe it. Because while my son enjoyed his newfound freedom, signing deals, posing for photos, being the face of Warren Innovations, I was planning something different. See, there's a funny thing about growth. When a tree grows too tall too fast, it forgets its roots. And when the storm comes, roots are the only thing that keep it standing. 3 weeks after I was fired, I got a call from an old friend, Charlie, our first investor. "Barney," he said, his voice uneasy, "your boy's making moves I don't like." I leaned back in my chair. "What kind of moves?" "He's merging with that tech group from Houston, the one that undercut you 2 years ago. Said it's for expansion, but I've seen this before. They'll strip the assets and dump the brand. I stayed quiet for a moment. I could almost hear the echo of my son's confidence in that glass office. It's just business, Dad. Business, indeed. Charlie, I said finally. Tell me, did he file the merger papers yet? Not yet. They're reviewing the legal structure. Something about IP ownership delays. Why? I smiled. Because that's the one part he can't touch without me. Charlie chuckled softly. You really planned ahead, didn't you? I tried to teach him to think long-term, I said. Guess I was the only one who listened. When I hung up, a calm washed over me. I wasn't angry anymore. I just felt steady, focused. That night, I drove to the workshop again. The air smelled of rain and rust. I flipped on the old fluorescent lights, grabbed a notepad, and began sketching. Not machines this time, but plans. If he wanted a world built on image, I'd remind him what substance looked like. The next morning, I made my first move. I called 3 of my oldest engineers, men who'd started with me in that tiny garage. Meet me at the shop, I said. We've got work to do. They came without hesitation. Gray hair, rough hands, tired eyes. But when they saw me, something sparked again. Barney, one of them said, we heard what he did. That kid's lost his damn mind. I smiled faintly. He's just lost his way. But we're not here to talk about him. We're here to build something new. And right there, in that dusty workshop with the smell of oil and old dreams, I picked up my wrench and started again. Not to compete, not to prove him wrong, but to remind him, and myself, that real legacy isn't built in glass offices or polished suits. It's built with hands, sweat, and heart. As the days passed, word spread. People who'd been pushed out of Warren Innovations, technicians, designers, even a few junior execs, started reaching out. They wanted to work with me. They called it a comeback. But I didn't see it that way. I wasn't coming back. I'd never really left. And while my son flaunted his success online, signing partnerships he barely understood, his empire was slowly beginning to lean. Because the foundation he'd cut loose was still holding more than he realized. The first cracks were forming. He just couldn't hear them yet. A month passed before I saw my son again. I didn't plan on it. But fate has a strange way of placing people exactly where they need to be, especially when lessons are due. It was a Thursday morning. I had gone downtown to meet a supplier for the small prototype shop we were rebuilding. As I walked past a cafe, I heard a familiar voice, smooth, confident, rehearsed. Trust me, gentlemen, he said. The old man was holding us back. Now that he's gone, we're scaling faster than ever. I froze. He was sitting at a corner table with 2 investors, laughing, his Rolex glinting under the sunlight. He looked polished, artificial. Not the boy who used to carry my toolbox and ask 1,000 questions. I stepped closer, just enough to hear. One of the investors leaned forward. But what about your father's patents? We've heard there are ownership complications. My son smirked. That smug, careless smirk I'd only seen once before, when he was 16 and thought he'd outsmarted everyone. Oh, that? Don't worry. I'll have my lawyers clean it up. He won't stand in the way. He's too old to fight. Old. That word hit me harder than the day he fired me. I turned away before he could notice me. My hands were shaking, not from anger, but from disappointment, so deep it felt like betrayal all over again. He wasn't just pushing me aside anymore. He was erasing me. That afternoon, I went home and opened the fireproof safe in my study. Inside were the documents I'd signed years ago, the original ownership deeds, the intellectual property agreements, and one letter I'd written when the company first went public. The letter wasn't for me. It was for him. I'd written it in case he ever lost his way. But now, reading those words, remember where you came from, son, I realized he wasn't lost. He'd chosen his path, and I needed to choose mine. 2 days later, the first cracks in his empire began to show. A supplier called me, frustrated. Mr. Warren, we haven't received payment in 3 weeks. Your son keeps delaying invoices. Is everything all right over there? I told him to keep his trust in me, not the company. He didn't ask questions. He'd worked with me long enough to know what that meant. By the end of the week, 3 more contractors reached out with similar complaints. My son had overextended himself. He was spending like a man who thought success was endless. But it never is. I didn't intervene. I just watched, quietly, patiently, like a carpenter who knows which beam is about to break. Then came the breaking point. A former employee, Jenna, One of my best engineers showed up at my workshop one evening, holding a box of company documents. Her eyes were red from crying. "They fired me today," she said. "He said I was too slow for his new vision. But before I left, I saw something. You need to look at this." Inside the box were financial records, reckless investments, hidden debts, and a proposal for the merger with the Houston Tech Group. The signature line for intellectual property authorization was blank, waiting for mine. "He's going through with it," I said quietly. Jenna nodded. "He's desperate. If that merger happens, everything you built will vanish." I stared at that empty signature line. It felt symbolic, the space where my trust used to live. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the rain streaking down the window, thinking about how a man could raise a son, teach him everything, give him everything, and still end up as the obstacle he wanted to remove. But somewhere between grief and anger, something else began to grow inside me. Resolve. If he wanted to treat me like a name on paper, I'd show him what that paper really meant. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. One to my lawyer, one to the board. By the time the sun rose, my son's world was already beginning to shift, though he didn't know it yet. Because I wasn't coming back to ask for what was mine. I was coming back to remind him that everything he stood on still belonged to me. My lawyer, Edward Briggs, had been with me for over 20 years. A man with a calm voice, silver hair, and a memory sharper than any machine I ever built. When I called him that morning, he didn't ask questions. "Barney," he said, "I figured this day might come. Then you know what I need." He sighed softly. "The patents are still under your name. The transfer clauses require your signature, just as you planned. If your son's merging with Houston Tech, they're walking into a trap they don't even see." I smiled faintly. "Good. Let's make sure they walk deep enough before they realize it." Edward chuckled. "You've still got that builder's patience, I see." "Patience," I said, "is the only tool you can't buy." That afternoon, I met him downtown. The law office smelled of paper and old ambition. We sat across from each other as he laid out the strategy. Clean, precise, legal. No yelling, no confrontation, just paperwork and truth. When he was done, he looked at me and said, "Once this motion is filed, your son won't be able to sell, merge, or transfer anything until a court reviews the ownership claims. It'll freeze his entire operation." "Do it," I said simply. As he left to begin the process, I walked to the window. Across the street, a massive billboard showed my son's face, smiling, confident, with the company's slogan beneath, "Innovation for the future." I whispered under my breath, "Innovation doesn't mean betrayal, son." That same evening, I went back to my workshop. The crew was waiting, the old engineers, a few designers, and Jenna, who'd refused to go home since the night she brought those documents. "We're not going to fight him," I told them. "We're going to build something better." They looked at me, confused but ready. I continued, "While he's chasing investors and fake partnerships, we'll work on the next generation of designs, the kind that doesn't just make money but changes lives. He forgot why we started this. We'll remind the world." The next 2 weeks were a blur of noise and sweat. The workshop came alive again. Sparks from welding torches, the hum of 3D printers, the smell of sawdust and metal. For the first time in years, I felt like myself. Meanwhile, news started spreading. Investors were growing nervous. The Houston merger had been delayed due to unforeseen legal complications. My son's assistant called me 3 times. I didn't answer. Then one night, as I was closing the shop, headlights flashed outside. A sleek black car pulled up, and out stepped my son. He didn't look confident anymore. His tie was loose, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He stood there for a moment before speaking. "You did this, didn't you?" I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "Did what, son?" He took a step closer. "The freeze order. The lawyers. The investors are panicking, Dad. Do you have any idea what this looks like?" I looked him straight in the eyes. "Yes, it looks like consequences." His jaw tightened. "You're trying to destroy me." I shook my head slowly. "No, I'm watching you destroy yourself. I just stopped you from burning down what's left of our name." He stared at me, silent, breathing hard. For a moment, I saw the boy I used to know, the one who stayed up all night building toy engines, the one who said, "One day, we'll make something the world will remember." But that boy was gone. "I don't need your help," he spat finally. "I'll find another way." He turned and stormed off, the car tires screeching into the night. As the sound faded, Jenna walked up beside me. He's not going to stop, is he? No, I said quietly. But neither will I. The next morning, I got a call from Edward. Barney, you might want to see this, he said. Your son just made a public statement, blaming you for sabotage and obstructing company progress. It's all over the news. For a moment, I felt the old ache in my chest, the heartbreak of being betrayed twice. But then I remembered something my father used to say. When they lie about you, stay silent. The truth makes its own noise. So I didn't respond. Not yet. Because the real noise was coming soon. Not from me, but from the collapse he was building with his own hands. And when it came, it would echo loud enough for the world to finally see who he'd become. The first sign of collapse wasn't in the headlines. It was in the silence. No new press releases. No confident speeches. No morning interviews with my son talking about innovation or family values. Just silence. The kind that follows when a storm has started, but no one wants to admit it. Then, one Monday morning, Edward called me. It's starting, he said simply. He didn't need to explain. By noon, the financial news sites had broken the story. Warren Innovations faces legal freeze over ownership dispute. By evening, the stock dropped 15%. And by nightfall, the Houston merger, the one my son had bet everything on, was officially suspended. I sat in my small living room, the TV flickering across my face, watching reporters speculate. Some said it was corporate sabotage. Others hinted at fraud. But I knew the truth. It wasn't sabotage. It was structure. The kind of structure that only a builder understands. The importance of foundations, the quiet strength that holds everything up. You can build your empire as tall as you want. But if you forget the man who laid the first stone, one day that stone will remind you who it belongs to. The next morning, my phone rang nonstop. Journalists, old employees, even investors who once ignored me. But I didn't speak to any of them. I wasn't interested in defending myself. I wasn't interested in victory. I wanted peace. That's why when my son finally called, I answered. Dad, his voice was rough, tired. We need to talk. Now you want to talk? He hesitated. I didn't know things would turn out like this. The lawyers, the board, they're saying I can't move any funds without your approval. I'm trapped. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence do the work. Trapped? No, son. You just built yourself a cage and forgot where the key was. He exhaled sharply. You don't understand. They're pulling out. The investors, they think you're coming for the company. Dad, please, tell me you're not going to ruin everything. I closed my eyes. I don't have to. You did that all by yourself. There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, fast and unsteady, like a man finally realizing the floor beneath him was gone. Why didn't you warn me? He asked. I did, I said softly. When you fired me. You just weren't listening. That ended the call. 2 days later, the board voted to remove him as acting CEO. Publicly, they called it a temporary leadership adjustment. Privately, they called it survival. And just like that, the company that once carried our name, my name, no longer had my son at the helm. The story made headlines for a week. Then, as always, the world moved on. People stopped caring. The markets recovered. The noise faded. But inside me, there was no joy, no pride, only a quiet ache, the kind that comes when you finally win a battle you never wanted to fight. One evening, Jenna came by the workshop with takeout and a stack of design blueprints. He's gone, isn't he? She asked gently. I nodded. The board asked me to return. Temporarily. To stabilize things. And will you? I looked at the plans spread across the table. Our new project, our rebirth. No, I said after a pause. That part of my life's over. I'll help them rebuild from afar, but I'm not going back there. She smiled faintly. Then what's next? I picked up a small metal prototype from the bench, a compact, sustainable engine we'd been developing for months. This, I said, something honest, something that lasts. Outside, the last traces of sunset glowed across the horizon. The world felt still again. For the first time since my son fired me, I felt free. But deep down, I knew the story wasn't finished. Because revenge isn't just about justice, it's about reflection. And soon, my son would have to face his. It was almost 2 months before I saw my son again. By then, the noise had died down. The company had stabilized under interim management, investors had returned, and the headlines had found new scandals to chase. I thought that was the end of it. Until one evening, there was a knock at my workshop door. When I opened it, he was standing there. No suit this time. No polished shoes, no boardroom arrogance. Just a tired man in a wrinkled shirt, eyes hollow from too many sleepless nights. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the old ceiling fan filled the silence between us. Finally, he said quietly, "You were right, Dad." I didn't answer. I just stepped aside and let him in. He looked around, his eyes scanning the old workbenches, the machines, the smell of oil and wood. He used to love this place as a boy. "I forgot what this place smelled like," he murmured. "Like work." I nodded. "Real work. Not meetings, not press releases. Work that makes something real." He sat down on one of the stools, running his fingers over the grainy surface of the table. "When I took over, I thought I was doing what you wanted. Expansion, investors, media attention. I thought you'd be proud." "I was proud," I said softly, "until you forgot who you were doing it for." He flinched. "I was scared, Dad. Scared of losing everything. Scared of being small." I looked at him, really looked at him. The same boy who used to stay up late in the garage, asking questions about engines, about life, about the future. Somewhere along the way, that boy had been swallowed by ambition. "You didn't lose everything," I said. "You just lost yourself for a while." He swallowed hard, eyes wet. "I hurt you. I know that now." "Yes," I said. "You did." The honesty in my voice made him look up. It wasn't anger anymore. It was truth. "But," I continued, "you're still my son. And this company, our name, it's not about ownership or control. It's about legacy. You can rebuild, but not the way you think. Not by chasing more. By remembering why we started in the first place." He looked down, his voice breaking. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Maybe not," I said gently, "but you'll earn it. Just not through words." We sat in silence after that. Two men bound by blood, failure, and lessons learned too late. Then, as if the universe needed a sign, the lights flickered, the old workshop electricity struggling to keep up with the machinery we'd been using. My son laughed softly through his tears. "Still haven't fixed the wiring, huh?" I smiled. "Some things don't need fixing. They just need someone to care again." He nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "Let me help you, Dad. This time, I'll do it right." I studied him for a long moment. The arrogance was gone. The pride had burned itself out, leaving something purer, humility. "All right," I said finally. "But this time, we build small. Honest. No headlines. Just work." He smiled faintly, the first real smile I'd seen from him in years. As he picked up a wrench from the table, the weight of it in his hand felt symbolic. A son finally remembering where he came from. That night, as we worked side by side again, I realized something profound. Revenge wasn't the moment his company fell apart. It wasn't the lawsuit, or the headlines, or the silence that followed. Revenge was this. Watching him come back, stripped of ego, searching for meaning in the ashes. Because sometimes the greatest punishment isn't losing everything. It's realizing what you destroyed was never yours to begin with. Working beside my son again felt both strange and familiar, like opening an old book whose pages still carried the scent of your youth, even if the story had changed. The first few days were quiet. Too quiet. We spoke little, letting the sound of tools and machinery fill the air instead. Every clang of metal, every turn of a wrench carried something unspoken. Regret, guilt, hope. He was slower than I remembered, cautious in every movement, as if afraid I'd correct him. I didn't. He didn't need criticism. He needed purpose. On the third day, he broke the silence. "I met with Jenna yesterday," he said. "I looked up from the workbench. And she's starting her own firm. Says she learned more from you in 2 years than from me in 10. I smiled faintly. "She's a good one. Always was." He hesitated. "She wanted me to tell you thank you. For standing up when I didn't." I nodded slowly. "It wasn't about standing up, son. It was about not letting something honest die." He nodded, then went back to tightening bolts. We worked for another hour before he spoke again. "Dad," he said quietly, "why didn't you just sell your shares and walk away? You could have been done with all of it." I paused, wiping my hands on a rag. Because I wasn't protecting money. I was protecting memory. He frowned. "Memory?" "Yes," I said. "Every nail, every blueprint, every hour we spent dreaming when we had nothing. That's worth more than any company." I wasn't going to let you sell it to people who never believed in it. He nodded, eyes distant. I understand that now. I really do. But something in his tone told me he was still carrying the weight of his mistakes like an anchor tied around his heart. Later that evening, after he'd gone home, I found myself sitting in the workshop alone, staring at the half-finished prototype on the table. It was beautiful, sleek, efficient, simple. The kind of design that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with creation in the first place. I ran my hand over the metal, feeling the coolness against my skin. The truth was, I wasn't angry anymore. But forgiveness isn't a switch, it's a slow thaw. And though the ice had started melting, the river beneath was still dangerous. A week later, we got a visit from one of the old board members, a man named Preston, the kind who always smelled like money and wore smiles that didn't reach his eyes. He arrived in a black car, stepping out with a practiced politeness. "Mr. Warren," he said, shaking my hand. "And young Warren, good to see you both together again." My son tensed slightly. "What do you want, Preston?" "Relax," the man said, smoothing his suit. "I come with an offer. The board wants stability. Investors want reassurance. They'd like to rebrand the company under both your names, father and son. Publicly, it would restore faith. Privately, it would mean real power again." I could almost feel the tension radiate from my son. The temptation was written all over his face. Fame, redemption, control. I stayed silent for a moment, then said, "I'm not interested." Preston blinked. "Excuse me. I'm not going back to boardrooms and cameras," I said firmly. "That world took enough from me. I've got what I need right here." He looked at my son. "Surely you understand the value of this opportunity. You could rebuild your image overnight." My son hesitated. For a moment, the old arrogance flickered, that hunger for recognition, the same one that destroyed everything before. But then he looked at me, and for the first time, I saw him make a choice, not for himself, but for something bigger. "No," he said quietly. "My father's right. We're done chasing the spotlight." Preston's smile faltered. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," my son replied, "but it'll be our mistake." The man left, clearly irritated. When the sound of his car faded, I turned to my son and said, "That was the smartest thing you've ever done." He smiled weakly. "Feels strange, doesn't it? Saying no to power." "It feels right," I said. "And that's rarer." As the days turned into weeks, something started to shift between us. The air grew lighter. The tension began to fade. We still didn't talk much about the past. Some wounds heal better in silence. But there was an unspoken understanding now. He showed up early, stayed late, asked questions again. Real questions. Not about profit or expansion, but about creation, legacy, craftsmanship. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, he looked at me and said, "You know, Dad, I used to think revenge was about making someone pay. But now I get it." I looked at him curiously. "What's that?" He smiled faintly. "Sometimes revenge is just letting them see what you've become and what they've lost by betraying you." I nodded slowly. "That's the quiet kind. The one that doesn't destroy, just teaches." We stood there, side by side, watching the light fade. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I'd lost a son. I felt like I'd finally found the man he was supposed to be. Peace never lasts forever, especially when money's involved. It had been nearly 3 months since Preston's visit, and things at the workshop were running better than I could have hoped. Orders were steady. Our prototype had caught the attention of a few independent investors, and my son, God bless him, was working like a man trying to atone for a lifetime. He was humbler now, focused, until the day a stranger walked through the workshop door. He was tall, polished, the kind of man who made his presence feel like a business card before he even spoke. "Barney Warren?" he asked, offering a firm handshake. "Name's Charles Denton. I represent Apex Engineering Group." I glanced at my son, who had already straightened his posture, sensing opportunity. "I've heard about your new design," Charles continued smoothly. "Compact, sustainable, efficient, revolutionary stuff. Apex would like to make you an offer. A real one." He handed me a folder. Inside were pages of figures, high figures, numbers that could buy comfort for several lifetimes. My son's eyes widened slightly. "That's a lot, Mr. Denton." Charles smiled. "Innovation deserves reward, and your father's legacy deserves recognition. We'd market it under the Warren name, father and son, together again. The world loves a redemption story." There it was again, the sweet poison of ego wrapped in opportunity. I closed the folder and handed it back. We're not for sale. Charles blinked. Excuse me. You heard me, I said. We're builders, not brands. He looked genuinely confused. You could change the world with this deal. Don't you want that? I smiled faintly. Changing the world and selling your soul are often advertised as the same thing. They're not. He chuckled softly, like I was just being sentimental. Then he turned to my son. Perhaps you understand what's at stake here. Your father's cautious, but this is your chance to rebuild your reputation, to be more than a footnote in your company's history. My son froze. I saw it in his eyes, the battle raging inside him. Pride versus principle. The same choice that had cost him everything once before. I didn't say a word. I just watched. After what felt like an eternity, he shook his head slowly. You don't get it, Mr. Denton. I already tried to buy my way into meaning once. It doesn't work. Charles looked between us, clearly irritated. Gentlemen, this offer won't last forever. Neither will we, I said evenly. But that's not why we build. For the first time, the man's polished smile faltered. He closed the folder and stood up. You'll regret this. Maybe, I replied. But at least the regret will be mine. He left without another word. The sound of his car fading down the road was followed by a long silence between me and my son. Finally, he spoke. That was a lot of money, Dad. I nodded. It was. We could have retired. I smiled faintly. I thought I did. He laughed softly, shaking his head. You're something else. Maybe, I said. But I'd rather be something honest than something rich. He looked at the workbench, then back at me. You know, years ago, I would have taken that deal in a heartbeat. I know, I said gently. That's why it means more that you didn't today. That night, after he left, I sat alone again in the quiet workshop. Outside, the world kept spinning, the lights of the city glowing like promises I'd long stopped believing in. I picked up one of our prototypes, a small, clean engine no larger than a coffee mug, and set it running. Its hum filled the room, steady and alive. It wasn't the sound of wealth. It was the sound of redemption. I realized something then. Forgiveness isn't a single moment. It's a series of choices, to stay, to trust, to build again even when everything's been broken. And my son had just made one of those choices. For the first time in a long while, I felt proud, not of what we built, but of who we were becoming. Peace always ends quietly. You never hear the crack until it's too late. It was a cold morning when I arrived at the workshop and found the front door ajar. Inside, the place was chaos. Papers scattered, tools thrown to the floor, our prototype table overturned. My heart dropped. Jack, I called out. No answer, only the echo of my own voice. Then I saw him, sitting against the far wall, bruised, holding his arm. Dad, his voice trembled. They came. I rushed to him. Who? Denton's people, he said through clenched teeth. They broke in. Said Apex owned the concept, that we'd stolen their design. They tried to take the prototype files. I froze. Did they get them? He shook his head. No. I hid the drives before they came. But they took the schematics from the desk. I clenched my fists. Apex had crossed a line, not business, but humanity. We called the police, filed reports, but I knew how this game worked. People like Denton didn't break laws. They bent them until they snapped around smaller men. Later that day, Edward, my lawyer, came by the workshop. They're planning to claim intellectual ownership, he said grimly. They're saying your son leaked the designs during his time at Warren Innovations. They'll try to drag you both down in court. My son buried his face in his hands. I told you, Dad. I ruin everything I touch. I placed a hand on his shoulder. No, son. This time, we fight smart. Over the next week, I went through every file, every patent, every piece of documentation we had. Buried deep in the archives, I found it. A prototype sketch dated 5 years before the merger with Houston Tech. My signature. My son's handwriting in the corner. It was ours. Legally, historically, undeniably ours. Edward smiled when he saw it. This is the nail in their coffin. Denton doesn't stand a chance. But I didn't smile back. I wasn't thinking about winning. I was thinking about my son, sitting there with his arm in a sling, quiet, broken. The boy who once thought he had to conquer the world now understood how fragile it was. A few days later, the hearing began. Apex brought in their lawyers, slick, expensive men with cold eyes. They talked about corporate ownership, conceptual overlap, and market protection. All the words people use to disguise greed. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up slowly. My voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. I'm not here to talk about markets or shares, I said. I'm here to talk about something rarer, integrity. My son made mistakes. So did I. But what we built came from our hands, not your contracts. You can buy patents, but you can't buy honesty. And that's what this engine was built on. The room was silent. For a moment, I could feel everyone breathing, waiting. Then Edward placed the sketch on the table. Dated, signed, and notarized, he said. 5 years prior to Apex's first prototype. The opposing lawyer's face went pale. Denton's jaw tightened. The judge looked over the documents, then said simply, "Case dismissed." It was over. We walked out into the sunlight. My son exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. "We actually did it," he whispered. I smiled faintly. "No, son. You did." He turned to me, confused. "You could have given up. You could have run like before. But you stayed. You fought. That's all I ever wanted to see in you." He looked at me with eyes that finally understood what pride was supposed to feel like. Not loud, not arrogant, but earned. When we got back to the workshop, most of the mess was still there. The broken glass, the overturned table, the dust. But I didn't want to clean it up right away. I wanted to remember it. Because every scar tells a story. He turned to me and said softly, "Dad, I know I can't change what I did before, but I promise, I'll spend the rest of my life building things worth your name." I nodded. "Then I'll spend mine making sure you never forget it." He smiled, and for a moment, he looked like the boy from years ago, covered in grease, full of dreams, asking too many questions. Only now, the world was quieter, wiser, and so was I. Months passed. The seasons shifted. The workshop windows fogged in the mornings now, the kind of frost that comes before winter when everything slows down just enough for reflection. Business was steady. Nothing grand, nothing noisy, just honest work. The kind that smelled like oil and sawdust instead of money and perfume. My son came every morning at 7 sharp. No one told him to. He just did. We barely spoke about the company anymore. The lawsuits, the betrayal, even the headlines, they'd all faded into the background noise of life. Sometimes we worked side by side for hours without saying a word. But in that silence, there was peace. I'd catch him watching me sometimes, studying my hands as I shaped a piece of steel or adjusted a tool, like he was memorizing the rhythm of creation itself. And maybe he was. Maybe he'd realized that legacy isn't written in contracts or carved on buildings. It's passed from hand to hand, like a living thing. One afternoon, I sat outside on the bench behind the shop, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in those deep orange tones that make you think of old photographs. My son joined me, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed me one and sat beside me without a word. For a while, we just watched the light fade. Then he said quietly, "I used to think success was about being seen, about being the loudest voice in the room. And now?" I asked. "Now I think success is just building something that outlives you and still means something when you're gone." I smiled, feeling the warmth of the coffee in my hands. "That's the only kind of success that lasts, son." He nodded, eyes glistening slightly in the golden light. "You know, Dad, I still don't understand how you never broke. After everything I did. After I threw you out of your own company." I chuckled softly. "Oh, I broke all right. You just didn't see it. But I learned a long time ago, some things aren't worth breaking loudly over. Some lessons need quiet." He looked down, ashamed. "I'm sorry." I reached over and put a hand on his shoulder. "You already said that. With your actions. That's all that matters." A soft wind moved through the trees behind the shop. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed. Faint, familiar, like time itself moving forward. I thought of all the years we'd lost, all the words left unsaid. But sitting there with him, I realized something simple and profound. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it just changes how it ends. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, he turned to me. "You know, I've been thinking, we should call the new design something. Something that honors where it all started." I raised an eyebrow. "Got a name in mind?" He smiled. "The Warren Engine. Version 1. For the man who never stopped building." I laughed softly. "You always did have a flair for marketing." He grinned. "This time, it's not about marketing." We sat there until the stars began to appear, both of us lost in thought. And for the first time in years, I felt the kind of peace that can't be bought or built, the kind that comes from knowing you've finally finished what life started. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with understanding. I looked at my son, my greatest creation, my hardest lesson, and said quietly, "You know, son, you didn't fire me. You freed me." He looked at me, puzzled. "Freed you?" I nodded. "From the noise. From the need to prove myself. You made me remember why I started all this in the first place. Not for success, but for purpose." He didn't reply. He just smiled, and I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there for years: gratitude. As the night grew darker, the workshop lights glowed behind us, warm and steady, like a heartbeat. And I realized then, legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build inside the people who stay. 6 months had passed since the courtroom battle that ended it all. The snow was melting outside the workshop, revealing patches of grass fighting their way through the cold ground, like life refusing to quit. Things had changed. The world had moved on, as it always does, but in our small corner of it, peace had finally settled. Quiet, steady peace. The company, our company, was doing better than it ever had, though now it wasn't run from glass towers or corporate offices. It breathed here, in the smell of steel, wood, and coffee-stained blueprints. My son, Jack, had grown into the man I'd always hoped he'd become. There was no more rush in his voice, no more hunger to prove something to ghosts that weren't watching. Just focus, humility, presence. Every morning, he'd arrive early, shovel the snow from the path, and warm up the machines before I even walked in. He'd brew coffee, lay out the plans, and always greet me with the same line: "Morning, old man. Ready to build something honest?" Every time he said it, I felt something loosen in my chest. That guilt he carried, the one I thought might bury him, was finally turning into purpose. We'd started taking in apprentices, young men and women who wanted to learn the craft, the real kind of creation, not the kind you find in boardrooms. They called me Mr. Warren, but I always told them, "Barney's fine. Titles are for people who stopped working." It felt good to pass something on. Not money, not power, knowledge. One of the kids, a quiet boy named Eli, once asked me, "Mr. Barney, is it true your son fired you once?" Jack froze when he heard it. I laughed. "Yeah, it's true. He fired me." Eli looked confused. "Then why are you working with him again?" Jack looked at me, waiting to see what I'd say. "Because forgiveness," I said, "isn't for the person who hurt you. It's for the part of yourself that still hurts." The boy thought about it for a moment, then nodded, as if he understood, maybe not fully, but enough to carry the idea. Later that night, when everyone had gone home, Jack came to me and said quietly, "You didn't have to say that. You could have told him I was wrong." I smiled. "You were, but you're not anymore." He didn't answer, just nodded and got back to work, sketching a new design with the same hands that once threw everything away. That night, as I watched him draw, I realized something I hadn't before. Revenge had turned into wisdom. The world thinks revenge is about payback, about making someone suffer. But it isn't. It's about understanding, about letting life finish the lesson you started. And life had taught us both well. A few weeks later, we got an invitation to speak at a small engineering college in Denver. They wanted us to talk about innovation, but what they really wanted, what they always want, was a story. Jack didn't want to go at first. "Public speaking's your thing, Dad," he said. I chuckled. "Since when?" He grinned. "Since you taught me everything worth saying." We went together. The students were young, full of ideas, full of speed. The same kind of energy I used to have when I thought success was something you could touch. Jack spoke first. He told them about ambition, failure, betrayal, and how none of it mattered if you forgot why you started. I watched him speak, proud and quiet. When it was my turn, I walked up to the microphone and said, "Everyone here wants to build something that lasts. But remember this, the strongest things you'll ever build won't be made of steel or code. They'll be made of people. Treat them like they matter, because when you forget that, everything else you make will eventually collapse." There was a stillness in the room when I finished. Then applause, not loud, but real. Afterward, one of the professors shook my hand and said, "You must be proud of your son." I smiled. "I am, but I'm prouder of the man he decided to become." On the drive home, Jack was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You know, I think I finally get it. Legacy isn't what people remember you for. It's what they remember you by. I nodded, staring out at the snow-covered fields rolling past. Exactly. Legacy's not a name on a building. It's a blueprint someone carries long after you're gone. He grinned. Then I guess we did all right. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see my son as the boy I raised. I saw him as the man who'd finally learned how to stand. When we got back to the workshop that night, the lights were still on inside. The machines hummed softly, and a new prototype sat on the table, smaller, smoother, better than anything we'd built before. Jack turned to me. Think we've still got one more in us? I smiled, picked up my wrench, and said, always. The world outside kept turning, unaware of two men rebuilding what pride had once broken. But that didn't matter. Because some stories don't end with revenge. They end with peace, and the sound of a father and son building side by side again.